Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar, which is being hosted by AHDB Beef and Lamb. My name is Chloe McKee, and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb within AHDB. I'm delighted to bring you tonight's webinar on Signet's new analysis for terminal sire sheep breeds. Our speaker tonight is Sam Boon. Sam works for AHDB as the Signet Manager. The plan of action is that Sam will run through a presentation and there will be time for questions at the end. You will all stay muted throughout the webinar, but if anyone would like to ask a question, then please type your question into the box on the side of your screens. I will then ask Sam your questions at the end of the presentation. Hopefully there won't be any technical difficulties, but please bear with us if there are any. So without further delay, I will hand over to Sam.
Well, thank you very much, Chloe, and it's very nice to speak to you all this evening. This is quite an exciting piece of work to talk about. It comes at the end of 3 or 4 years worth of research, and it's probably the biggest change that I've seen in the 20 years that I've worked with AHDB and its predecessors. So I sometimes think it's useful just to be able to see who you're listening to. I'm just going to move that down on my screen. So this is me. This was taken a few years ago for I had children. I've aged a lot since then. But I'm a farmer's son from Norfolk, graduating from Reading and Bangor, and very fortunate to be a Nuffield scholar. And I quite like Twitter, so feel free to send me messages via that. There we go, we'll do that. So just a little bit about Signet Breeding Services. Signet is actually the National Genetic Evaluation Service for sheep. We've been involved for about 40 years and ultrasound scan about 40,000 lambs a year with a vast range, and actually as of tonight an ever increasing range of traits. So pedigree breeders use the service to identify the animals with the best genetics within their flocks, and that information can be used to help commercial producers, of which I'm sure there's many listening tonight, to find the most profitable rams for their production system. And the reason we get excited about genetics is the vast pace of genetic gain that can be achieved in sheep. They have a relatively small generation interval, and over a period of time we can make great changes. This is just a chart showing the scan weight EBV for Charolais, looking at the first year when they started the Sire reference scheme, right through to 2018. And these are the animals we were very excited about, and we're going to use as potential reference rams. And today they'd be the first ones that you would send out the door because the breed has moved on so much in terms of genetic gain. So if that's working well, why do we need to actually bring in any changes? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is that we currently do about 3 blood runs a year, and it'd be lovely to be able to do those on a monthly basis. Secondly, there's a lot of new traits and developments that we'd like to introduce, and it's much better to have a single multi-breed analysis, which is what we're moving to, rather than lots of individual analyses that all need updating at various different points. So a single analysis is a much more streamlined way of producing EBVs, and by that I mean estimated breeding values. For my pedigree breeders, I've got some that rear more than one flock on the same holding, or have a son and daughter that has sheep on the same holding, so we can link them for the first time. We also have more flocks that are producing crossbred animals, so Suftexes, for example, and the analysis service enables us to analyze those, take into account hybrid vigor, and produce accurate breeding values for them. We can also use the new service to pull in commercial data. So some of you will have heard about Ram Compare, that's our national progeny test, and again the new approach will enable that. So if we're developing all of these changes, all these new traits, it's a really good opportunity to actually rebase the EBVs and the indexes. So at present, the EBVs relate to a base in 1990. We're going to bring that back up to date. Oops. So what have we got? We've got a multi-breed evaluation with over 3 million records, which are analysed on a monthly basis, 12 different breeds involved, and we've updated the genetic parameters that are used to calculate those breeding values. So the heritability values, which indicate how much of a trait is under genetic influence, and the correlations. So that means the relationships between traits. So basically the building blocks for EBVs have been completely updated using all the information we have available. So the big changes, one change is that we're changing the way we express our estimated breeding values for carcass traits. So we're moving them onto a weight-adjusted basis, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about that in a moment. Secondly, we've got some new traits from the CT scanner. We're going to rebase to a breed-specific base from this multi-breed analysis, and then we've got some new indexes that are being developed. So some quite big changes and some important messages to get across to commercial ram buyers next season. One of the changes is that actually the Texel Sheep Society will be taking their own recording in-house next year, so they won't be serviced directly through Signet, but they'll still be utilising the mixed breed analysis and reporting results back to their individual members. So for information about the Texel recording service, you really need to be chatting to the Texel Society next year. So one of the big changes is a move to weight-adjusted traits. At the moment, if you have a breeding value of +2 for muscle depth, it means that animal has the genetic potential to have an extra 2 millimeters of muscle at a fixed age. If we move to a fixed weight basis, it means that an animal with a breeding value of +2 has an extra 2 mil of muscle at a fixed weight. And that's probably a much better prediction of both muscling and of fatness, because people will select animals tending to take them at a fixed weight as opposed to slaughtering them on their birthdays. If you think about it at the moment, how do you get a high muscle depth sheep? Well, you actually get it in two ways. One is just that it's big. It's a massive sheep that you put in front of the technician and he measures it, and unsurprisingly, it has a deep eye muscle depth to go with it. Secondly, is that the animal actually has a really deep eye muscle depth relative to its size. So it might not be the biggest, but it's got a real good depth of muscle relative to the size of the animal. Now, we've already got breeding values for scan weight that will tell us all about an animal's ability to grow. It will tell us which the big sheep are. So I would argue it's time that we actually had muscle and fat breeding values that are independent of the size of the animal, particularly as we tend to kill animals at a fixed weight. So as a commercial producer sends lambs down the race, puts his hands on the back of these 40-kilo lambs, he knows exactly what sort of level of muscling and finish he's going to be getting. It's a much more commercially focused way to express the breeding values. And I've got a quick chart that sort of shows what we're looking for. This is the scan weight of Charolais lambs in this case. Got a lot of Charolais examples here. This is their live weight when they're scanned, so after a vast range of live weights, this is their muscle depth, and you can see that actually their weight accounts for a lot of the difference that we see in muscle depth. But we're interested in all of these animals that have really good muscle depths relative to their size. So it's actually meaning that these traits are a better predictor of the yield that you're going to get from these carcasses. And that's particularly true when it comes to the CT traits. So in the past, we've had breeding values for CT lean weight and CT fat weight, and they told you about the kilograms of muscle and fat you get at a fixed age. Now, they'll tell you about the amount of extra muscle you'll get at a fixed weight. So really a good indicator of yield. So what the change is going to look like? Well, here's 3 rams in my example. You can see one that's fairly average in terms of scan weight, and you can see 2 that have quite high scan weight EBVs, and in terms of muscling, again, 2 that are average and 1 that's quite high. That's on the old age-adjusted approach to muscle depth. If we weight adjust them, then Ram A looks a little bit better for his muscle depth EBV. He doesn't go zooming up the rankings because he still has a much lower scan weight EBV. He's giving 5 kilos to the rest, so he's not going to get a sky high index. Ram C was the top ram for muscle depth, and he's come down a bit because we know some of that superiority was just because he was a very big animal with very high growth potential. And Ram B is the one that's probably affected the most in people's eyes because he's gone from looking average to looking actually very ordinary in terms of muscle depth. He's just a big growing sheep. But if you actually scale that muscle depth back relative to his size, he would look a bit more ordinary compared to the others. You can see overall the variation is reduced because some of the variation between animals is actually due to their size. So we've now taken that into account. Similar story in terms of fat depth. So the same growth characteristics of these rams, one average and two high. And then we've got two of them that are, let's say, average for fat depth and one that would be considerably fatter. If we weight adjust them, you can see the slower growing animal will have a slightly more positive fat depth EBV. The very fat one, Ram C, actually doesn't look so extreme now because we can see that actually had very high growth potential, which was part of that story. But Ram B, which was average for fat depth, now looks that he's leaner than average because actually he's a very fast growing animal, and so at a fixed weight you would expect that he's actually going to be leaner. So for breeders that have selected for slightly more positive fat depths in recent years, they might start to still see a few animals coming through with negative fat depth EBVs at a fixed weight. And it's particularly important to realize that if you select for very high amounts of muscle within the carcass, certainly in terms of CT lean weight, at a fixed weight, there's always going to be a tendency, you're displacing something, and so there's a tendency that those animals may be leaner at a fixed weight. And hence, breeders can actually select, if they want to avoid that, for slightly fatter genetics in the background to create that balanced sheep. So, what do we know about weight-adjusted traits? One thing is there's going to be less genetic variation. So if you've been seeing muscle depths between -3 and +5 in the past, well, that range is greatly reduced because some of that was due to their size. What we do see is that the heritability is higher. That's fantastic. That means more of the variation can be accounted for by the genetics, and we can actually make more accurate predictions with our estimated breeding values of those traits. The great news is that it isn't a change of direction. It's not a complete U-turn. If the old and the new muscle depth EBVs had no relationship to each other, Signet clients would understandably say, what on earth have we been doing for the last 20 years? In reality, there's a good strong correlation there, but there will be some re-ranking of individuals, particularly if they have very different growth characteristics. But people selecting have been going in the right direction in terms of increasing total yield. And also some of the trait relationships have changed, and I sort of explained that. Now we see that at a fixed weight, if animals are putting more muscle into the carcass, there's a tendency for them to be a little leaner, and again, we can counteract that through our breeding decisions. Now we've got a better handle on it. I believe quite strongly it's a real commercial win. It's exactly the sort of thing that commercial producers have wanted, particularly when talking about having the optimum fat depth for getting the optimum level of finish without penalty for fatness or over leanness. Actually having the fat traits expressed on a weight-adjusted basis when you kill the lambs is a big step forwards. It's consistent with approaches in Australia and New Zealand, and actually I believe Innovis and Breedplan will do similar things as well. So it's a sensible route to take, and it's a well-trodden path, and it isn't an anti-growth crusade. Growth rate's still extremely important, and if anything, we may have to place slightly higher weightings on EBVs like scan weight within the overall index because we're not increasing it indirectly through the weightings that we've got on other traits, which is what was happening in the past. So I'm just going to talk about some of the new CT traits for a moment. These obviously are of more interest for flocks that either have the ability to CT or have been regularly buying in CT scanned ram lambs and stock rams for their own use. One of the things people have wanted to do for many years is to actually have a breeding value for eye muscle area. That's very difficult to do with ultrasound. You tend to lose the edges of the image, but it's actually very straightforward to do with the CT scanner. So we've gone back through the last 10,000 CT images. We've got the traces of eye muscle area. the traces of depth and width, and we can analyze all of those. All the information will be used in the background. The one that you'll actually see will be eye muscle area, and we'll have a breeding value for that in the first time, so increasing area across the loin. I suppose the good news is we can also see from that work what a good predictor eye muscle depth is of total area. So getting technicians out on farms to measure depth is increasing area. In terms of the spinal traits, we can actually get 6 different measurements across the spine. There's actually differences in the number of vertebrae in the thoracic region, so that's up to over the lungs, and in the lumbar region, where we have the most expensive cuts from the lamb. There's difference in both the number of vertebrae and in the length in those regions. So we can see a little bit of that difference in terms of breed differences here, with most of the variation being expressed in terms of the number of lumbar vertebrae. And we know that's under genetic control, and so we can actually build that into our breeding programs. That doesn't mean we want to confuse the living daylights out of commercial producers with 6 different spine trait EBVs, but I have a number of clients that I know are interested in enhancing length and are interested in the number of chops they can get from commercial lambs. So this is giving them some really quite useful information in that respect. The other breeding value we've got, and it's a bit of a first within the sheep industry, but it's a breeding value for meat eating quality. So the CT image that you look at is actually an image of density. And we've got bone coming through as white, we've got air will come through as black, and muscle and fat coming through as different shades of grey. But if we actually zoom into that loin, we can actually detect differences in density between animals. And a really good piece of work by Neil Cleland as part of his PhD has been able to look at the calibration between that measurement and intramuscular fat. So it's essentially a proxy trait for intramuscular fat, and again, a breeding value that may help consumer acceptability. So those are some of the new traits. We will also have birth weight and lambing ease breeding values available. So that's all part of the story of lambs that are born successfully and more lambs successfully sold. We will produce a litter-sized reared EBV alongside a litter-sized born EBV. And the maternal ability EBV, which you've had in the past. So that's the genetics for milk production, identifying ewes that will be really good milky mums. That's having a bit of a shake-up. We've done lots of work looking at the relationships between traits for that, and actually found that a much simpler approach is probably going to give us better results. And lastly, fecal egg count is something that isn't particularly widely measured in terminal sire breeding programs. And at the moment, the breeding values that people see are dragged about all over the place by correlations with other traits. So chatting to the genetic experts up at Edinburgh, up at eGenes, the advice there is turn off the correlations for that trait. Those that wish to measure the trait will get a useful ranking within their flock, but probably withdrawing the publication for most flocks where that trait isn't being measured. One of the things that we will do is a rebase. So the analysis will actually analyze all sheep on a level playing field in a mixed breed analysis. We will then take that data out, and the Charolais will get EBVs that relate to the average Charolais in 2010. The Suffolks will get EBVs that relate to the average Suffolk in 2010. And there will be breed-specific benchmarks that will be updated. You can see from this that although we've gone to 2010, the 2018 animals already are a step ahead of those particular individuals. And so for growth rates, certainly most animals will tend to have positive breeding values. Some will clearly be much better than others. So that's a little bit about the rebasing that's going to take place. So what does it mean? Well, the interesting thing in the past is that where we headed off to the sales and people were interested in high growth and high muscle depth EBV sheep, they would tend to be similar animals. They were the bigger animals that excelled in both attributes. But now that we look at muscling independently of weight, then it will be harder, I think, to find the sheep that has it all. There'll be those that grow very fast but maybe a little plainer, those that have extremely high muscling but may grow a little slower, and those that can do both. And those are the animals that are clearly going to be interested in our future breeding programs. There's some work ongoing in terms of the new breeding indexes. And in fact, I've had those through in the last week or so. So I'm hoping to get them in front of clients fairly early next year. What we've done there is quite a lot of modeling work to optimize the selection for growth and muscle depth and lean weight in the carcass at the same time, bearing in mind that certainly muscle and growth are now being expressed independently of one another. And we've got some quite good solutions there that balance the two, while holding the current fat levels in the background. So we don't need to have the extreme penalties that we had in the past for ultra lean sheep, because we're now expressing the fat traits relative to the weight of that animal, and they will create a much better solution. We'll also have a maternal index. So this is something that the Dorset and indeed the Suffolk breeders have had for some years, where they've sold rams out to breed female replacements. And within that, we're looking to enhance number of lambs born, maternal ability, so milk production of the ewe, and early growth rates, without detriment to muscling, and just avoiding large increases in mature size. So there's a small negative penalty there for very big mature size in the background. So that's still under development, but we'll make results available for that very soon. So that gives you a little bit of an update in terms of our program of work. I've actually been out on the road with Signet clients over the last month. We've held about 16 individual meetings across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And there's been a really warm reception to this work and quite a bit of excitement about the changes, which are the first big update for several years. The message is out there for both pedigree breeders and commercial ram buyers that the EBVs will change. There'll be a little bit of re-ranking, and there will be a new base. So we'll be expressing these figures relative to the 2010 lamb crop. The carcass trait EBVs will change the most, but I think they'll be more useful for commercial producers. And we have got a few new traits that are being developed alongside. So that's my summary, Chloe. Have we got any questions in?
Thanks, Sam. So while I'm waiting for some questions to come up, I would like to remind everyone that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available to watch back on the AHDB YouTube channels. That's along with other previous webinars from AHDB Beef and Lamb. So the first question is, when will the new indices be available?
So that's a good question. So Signet clients have had a taster of the estimated breeding values where they've come along to meetings, and we've had a bit of time to sit and go through those. The index is available. We're just doing the final bit of QA on those, but I'm hoping in early January we should be in a position to actually send spreadsheets out to clients to actually have a look at their animals for them to see how they rank. So I'm hoping during January we'll have a flurry of information going out to Signet clients.
Thanks, Sam. And will these indices be breed specific?
Oh, sorry, I better finish the end of that first bit of the question. So those will go out to Signet clients. We're actually developing a new database at the moment, and that will give us a way of displaying information online. So long before the ram buying season this year, information will then be publicly available online, and that will be an aid for commercial producers who obviously see the figures on charts at sales and in catalogues, but the information will also go online shortly. I think your second question was about whether the indexes will be breed specific. We've talked about this quite a bit. What was interesting is when you look at all the different indexes we had in the past, they broadly did a very similar thing, even if the weightings were quite different between CT traits and the things we measure on farm. Rates of gain were very similar across all 12 of the breeds. So they were already doing a similar thing. And it's been felt that within this project, the important thing is to have an industry standard. So to have a single index with the same weightings for all the breeds that will be used. That's exactly the same as they do in New Zealand. They have a single index, terminal sire index, that's used for all of the breeds. That's what we're going to do.
Thanks, Sam. Sorry about that. I was jumping the gun there. Why have you rebased to 2010 and not 2015? And when would you rebase again?
We had a bit of discussion around this. If you have a very recent base, then there's a bit more danger of animals or the base moving. So let's say we get some additional pedigree coming through from a number of large flocks or an additional data source from a society perhaps. You suddenly get new 2015 animals coming in, and it then moves those, and because it moves those, every other animal moves in the evaluation. So we're always a little risk averse not to go too recent with the base. The other reason for doing that is it does help a little bit on the marketing side of things. Breeders have made a lot of progress since 2010, and it's a way of partly rewarding that genetic gain that's been achieved and locked in. So that's the 2010 base. We haven't got a precise answer in terms of when we'll rebase again, but it'll certainly become more regular. So maybe 4 or 5 years, we'll look to actually roll that base on again. I think that would be a sensible thing to do.
Thanks. What is the optimum weight?
We talk to people when it comes to scanning. In the past, we spent lots of time talking about age and saying, well, you scan at so many weeks of age. But actually, the important thing is that the animals are big enough when they go in front of the technician, that they're heavy enough, they're expressing difference in muscle, and they're expressing difference in fat levels and finish. Current recommendations are that you scan lambs between sort of 40 and 50 kilos in terms of weight. Now, I know that tends to be a little higher than current slaughter weights, but that accounts for the fact that in most flocks, there'll be some younger lambs, some smaller lambs, and it avoids us doing too many lambs in the sort of low 30s in terms of weight. So if we aim a little bit higher than slaughter weight, it means we don't have too many tiddlers coming through. But it is important to think about weight when scanning these animals on farm and contacting your technician to get them measured.
Thanks, Sam. When are we going to see a measurement that takes into account production system? So this person has Suffolks that live outside, and they know plenty that are inside for up to 6 months of the year on ad lib creep.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, at the moment, we build into the analysis that essentially the farm effect. We know that there are some farms where the animals can weigh twice as much as on others, and that's nothing to do with their genetics. That's due to their feeding and management. Because there tends to be reasonable genetic linkage between flocks, we can actually take that into account. The best example is a ram that's been used widely. He's producing lots of half sibs, so we know on average their genetics are the same. If those lambs are twice as heavy on one farm as another, it's fairly obvious it's not the genetics, it's a farm effect, and we can take that into account. And that actually works extremely well. Every year, I will occasionally see flocks with very high weights, but very low EBVs, and that's the system saying, well, actually, we don't think these are particularly good genetics. This is a farm feeding effect. And likewise, we can often have some quite light animals sitting at the top of the system, which shows the analysis is picking up animals that are performing well, but on a very commercial environment. Ram compare is at a relatively early stage, but isn't tending to show massive re-ranking, which is really good. So we will undoubtedly be having some rams or semen from rams coming out of flocks with a very, very high level of feeding. But when those animals are used commercially, those with good genes for growth, those with good genes for muscling, are still expressing it in their progeny, even when those progeny are either having a totally forage-based diet or a forage-based diet with just a little bit of creep feed in the background. So it does give us confidence that even if rams are reared under that environment, we're still picking out the best genes for growth and carcass attributes. Having said that, there is a danger if you have animals from very, very highly fed environments that they have poor ram longevity, poor fertility, and all the issues that go with that. So that isn't me condoning the selection of rams from highly intensive environments. And the best advice is still to try and find animals selected under environments that are similar to your own. And we have more and more shearling producers now that are lambing later, lambing on forage, and actually testing how these animals perform under a commercial environment, which is the same as, I guess, the remit for Ram Compare.
Thanks, Sam. Will Dorset breeders get an update on the 8-week weight figures that were recently issued? Are these now being used for selection, for retention, or slaughter?
Yes, they can do. Dorset breeders are fantastic. They tend to be some of the earliest within our production year, with a lot of September and October lambers there. And what I don't want to do is have confusing messages going out to them. So we'll have the existing service available to them, but we're making good progress with the new evaluations, and so I will make that information available to them as well. And as we get closer, we're still some way off Mayfair, but as we get closer to Mayfair, we'll have a think about which set of figures we put in those catalogues. I suspect it will be the brand new ones. And in January, I intend to do a rerun of the results. I'm still using a December snapshot, but a January rerun specifically to get Dorset breeders the latest results with their scanning data in it.
Thank you. And will Texel breeders get the new information too?
Texel breeders, I guess, will get their information via the Texel Society. So the Texel Society is currently chatting to eGenes up in Edinburgh about the type of analysis that they're going to get next year. And they'll be first of all, having a look at the EBVs to see what they mean. And then they'll be planning ways to actually get those out in front of their clients.
Thanks. And is there a recommended minimum weight for scanning?
You probably wouldn't want to have too many lambs going in around less than 30 kilos. The challenge there being they're going to be very lean. They're going to typically be less than a mil of fat. And so you don't pick up much variation in fatness. I suppose we're a little less preoccupied with fatness than we would have been 10, 15 years ago, because we've made such strides to improve growth, improve muscling, and hence it's dealt with many of the challenges we have in terms of finish as lambs reach slaughter. From a genetic point of view, there's a lot we can do in terms of selecting lambs for slaughter. But yeah, that would tend to be the lower level.
Thank you. I'll just remind everyone that if you have got a question, please type it in now, as we only have one left. So how different do you think the overall indexes will be?
Well, I've been looking at some Charolais data this morning, as it happens, and the correlation between the old run and the new run is about 0.91. So a value of 1 would mean they rank exactly the same. Obviously, 0 means no relationship at all. So a figure over 0.9 means there's actually a very strong relationship. That's probably partly due to the changes about 4 or 5 years ago with Charolais, where we actually tweaked the weightings a little bit to basically favour muscling and yield of meat in the carcass. And so there won't be such dramatic changes in the background. What I can see is if I pull out the very best Charolais on the old index and pull the very best ones out on the new index, they achieve similar rates of progress for growth, but they actually make a bit faster progress in terms of muscling across the loin, and they make slightly more progress in terms of overall yield of meat from the carcass. So I can see some improvements. I guess I'm reassured that it isn't a dramatic re-ranking. And if that holds for Charolais, then I fully expect it to hold for Hamps and Meatlinks and Suffolks. And we've got some quite high correlations in those breeds as well. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head.
Thanks, Sam. We've got a statement here. The 40 kilo to 50 kilo weight guide is just too late for the use of ultrasound to aid selection. Most of the stock will have gone to slaughter at those weights.
Yeah, it's always a compromise. By coming earlier, we can capture more of those animals that are on farm. You have to remember that in the pedigree flocks, a large chunk of animals will be retained anyway. The females will be retained for breeding, rams will be retained for sale. But particularly in breeds where they're quite selective in terms of the ram lambs retained, so Hamps and Shropshires, I'm thinking of in particular, if we can come in early and get those lambs where the top ones are sort of 42, 44 kilos, and get lots of them measured on farm, then we're actually capturing more data on ram lambs that will eventually go for slaughter. So in those farms, we're already going in earlier, going in a bit lighter than we were doing in the past, and still finding animals with good levels of finish and getting some excellent measurements from them.
Thanks, Sam. So is there anything else you'd like to cover?
Well, I think those are some of the main bits for the evening. Obviously, we'll be out and about at NSA events next year. I'm sure there'll be a programme of activity through the Better Returns programme. If there are individual breed clubs that feel they'd like to have a speaker from Signet to come and talk about the changes at a slightly more leisurely pace, then we'd be very happy to send someone down to do that. There's a new booklet that will be available in the new year. That will go straight up onto the Signet website, and we will also be posting those out to both Signet clients and non-Signet clients. So I've got agreements from the Suffolk and the Charolais and the Dorset societies to actually make those available to non-recording clients so that they understand the changes when it enters new ram selling season. So an exciting year. Added to that, a new database, which is going to come in sort of April time. There's lots of things to look forward to.
Thanks very much, Sam. So thanks for that brilliant presentation, and thank you to everyone for listening. I'd like to remind you again that the presentation has been recorded, so it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channels, along with other previous webinars, should you want to revisit it. So the recording of this webinar will be emailed shortly as well, in case you'd like to recap on anything heard tonight. So thanks again, and have a good evening, everybody.
A very happy Christmas. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.